Guess who's back? It's another math episode from Mr. Mac. Alright. So in task 2 today we'll be working on adding and subtracting integers. Below I place two pictures, one to represent our integer elevator and the other one, which is a thermometer, to represent our temperature. So with the integer elevator, some of the things I wanted to point out is that we're going to start at 0 and move to our first number. So when adding integers, if it's a positive we go up, if it's a negative number we go down. But when subtracting integers, when we subtract a negative we go up. And the reason is because a negative times a negative gives us a positive outcome. But when we subtract a positive, we go down. Let's take a look at question number 1 together. We have -4 plus 8. So it's kind of like even looking at your thermometer. -4 is right over here, and we want to add 8 units, meaning we should need to go up 8 units. So take a look at what I'm going to draw over here. So over here towards the top, I drew 8 positive signs and 4 negative signs to represent our -4 and our positive 8. Alright, each of them represent 1 unit each. So if we have a positive and a negative, they simplify to 0. A positive and a negative, another positive and a negative, and another positive and a negative. And that leaves us with a total of 4. So by the time I finish this question, -4 plus 8, we should get the same exact quantity. Let's take a look. And once we separate our expression, the next step is to write the number that has a greater absolute value first. So when we compare 4 and 8, 8 has a greater absolute value, so I write down my 8, and I also write down my 4. In order to figure out what's going to be the sign that goes in the middle, we want to ask ourselves, are the signs attached to the numbers the same or are they different? Alright, in the circle with the -4 we have a negative, and in our other circle we have a positive in front of the 8. Since our signs are different, that's when we find the difference between both of our absolute values, and 8 minus 4 gives us 4. Before you're finished and you want to settle on your answer, we also need to check what was the sign of the number that had the greater absolute value. And the number we said earlier was the number 8. So since in front of the 8 we have a positive sign, that will be the sign attached to our 4, and that's why we get positive 4. Alright, when we take a look at our little diagram up here, we saw that there were more positives than negatives, so we should expect a positive answer. And the same thing will go with question 2, 3, and 4. Let's move on to question number 2. 6 minus -7. If we focus closely, this is a case of double signs. Alright, a case of double signs is basically when we have two of our signs next to each other with no number in between. So we have a negative and a negative. Those two signs are connected by the operation of multiplication. So a negative times a negative gives us a positive. Alright, when the signs are the same and we multiply them, we get a positive outcome. When the signs are different and we multiply or divide them, we get a negative outcome. So as we mentioned, a negative times a negative gives us a positive. And if you can do 6 plus 7 in your head, you're all done with this question and we get the answer of 13. Now on to question number 3. -8 plus -9. First thing I want to do is I want to take a look at my double signs. Alright, and we have a positive times a negative. And as we mentioned earlier, when the signs are different and we multiply or divide them, we end up with a negative outcome. So when I rewrite my question, I have -8 minus 9. Okay? So, once you get to this point, you ask yourself, can you solve this mentally? If you can't solve this mentally to get your answer, you can go ahead and separate your equation and find the absolute value of both quantities. Let's go ahead and separate our expression. Sorry for saying equation, alright? And make sure you understand the difference between an expression and an equation. We won't have any equal signs in our expression. So once you've separated your expression and we're looking at both quantities, you want to ask yourself, are the signs in both of my circles the same or are my signs different? We have a negative and a negative, so those signs are the same, so I'm going to expect to find the sum of both quantities, or the sum of both of their absolute values. The absolute value of -8 is 8. The absolute value of -9 is 9. In order to write in the next expression, you always want to lead with the number that had the greater absolute value, which is right here. So we rewrite that 9, and we bring down our 8, and 9 plus 8 gives us a sum of 17. The last step is always to take the sign of the number that had the greater absolute value. When we compare 9 and 8, the greater absolute value came from where this check mark is, and that was a negative. So we keep that negative. Alright? And that's what happens. If you have a negative number and you're subtracting, you should expect colder weather. The weather should be more negative. If you're on an elevator and you're starting on the -8th floor and you're subtracting 9, you should expect to be more within the negative numbers because you're traveling further down. So that's why the number is becoming smaller, or we'd say it's becoming more negative. All right, on to question number 4. The trick about solving a question like number 4 is ask yourself, do I know how to do the opposite? Something as 13 minus 9. If you can do 13 minus 9 and you know that's 4, then you need to think about what happens when you have the opposite question. You would expect the opposite parity or the opposite sign. So if I rewrite the question as 9 minus 13, which is exactly the opposite question from what we started with initially, we should expect 4, but it's going to be a negative. And that's what we mean by the opposite parity. The opposite parity of positive 4 gives us a negative 4. The end. So in question number 5, again, we see a case of double signs. We have a positive times a negative. Now both of the signs are different, so when we multiply two different signs, we should expect a negative outcome. So our new question now becomes 5 minus 13. Alright, and when you look at 5 minus 13, what I always like for everyone to think about is think about the opposite question. What if this question was 13 minus 5? Our difference would be 8. So if we're asking you the opposite question, we should expect the opposite sign. Okay, so then 5 minus 13 should basically be negative 8. And there goes your final answer. Question number 6, negative 4 minus 9. So I'm going to start this question by just rewriting the question. Negative 4 minus 9. Alright, and just like on it being an elevator, you're at the -4th floor and you're subtracting 9. Meaning we should be going down 9 more levels, approaching a more negative number. Alright, if that's a hard concept to grasp, then what I recommend you to do is separate your expression. Let's start by putting circles around our numbers. Now, when we look at them, the signs in our circles are both the same. When our signs are the same, we end up finding the sum of their absolute values. The absolute value of -9 is 9. The absolute value of -4 is 4. And we always want to lead with the value that has a greater absolute value. So that's 9 plus 4, and that gives us a quantity of 13. The last step is to take the sign of the number that had the greater absolute value. When we compare 4 and 9, the number that had the greater absolute value came from this side. So we take that negative sign and we attach it to our final result. On to question number 7. Question number 7 has 3 integers, but I always recommend take 2 at a time. In this case, since there's no multiplication or division, we're just going to attack it from the left to the right. So let's first start off with the 4 minus 12. If we know that 12 minus 4 is 8, and we're asking you the opposite question, that means 4 minus 12 would be -8. And now we're left with -8 plus 6. Alright, if you can't solve this in your head, alright, simply just separate your expression. So the absolute value of -8 is 8, and the absolute value of +6 is 6. Next, we want to find either the sum or the difference of their absolute values, depending on what are the signs inside our circle. So when we look at the signs inside our circles, we have a positive and a negative. Those are two different signs, so we want to find the difference between both of their absolute values. But we always want to lead with the number that had the greater absolute value. So we compare 8 and 6. 8 has the greater absolute value, and since we're finding the difference between both absolute values, 8 minus 6 gives us a quantity of 2. The last step of the question is to take the sign from the number that had the greater absolute value. So when you compare that -8's absolute value and +6's absolute value, -8 had the greater absolute value, so we take that negative sign. Alright, and lastly we're on to question number 8. Before we start, we do see a little bit of multiplication hidden there when we see our case of double signs. The double signs, again, are when we see two signs next to each other, but there is no number in between. So over here, we have a negative and a negative. If the signs are different and we're multiplying them, we should expect a positive outcome. So our new question, I'll rewrite it. We have -5 plus 6 plus 4. There's no longer any multiplication or division, so we can just work from the left to right, starting with first -5 plus 6. Okay? When we do that, if you can't solve it mentally, we want to first find out if the signs are the same or if they're different. When we look at both signs, we have a positive and a negative. Both signs are different, so we want to find the difference between their absolute values. The absolute value of positive 6 is 6, and the absolute value of -5 is 5. We always lead with the number that had the greater absolute value. So we're going to be finding the difference between 6 and 5 primarily. Make sure we don't forget about that plus 4 all the way over here. We'll come back to that. 6 minus 5 gives us a difference of 1, and we always want to take the sign from the number that had the greater absolute value. So when we compare both absolute values, the greater absolute value was with the positive 6. I bring down my plus 4, and 1 plus 4 gives me a sum of 5. All done.